It's our 13th lecture, but it's our first international lecture. So that's exciting. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Sue Kroeger, who is the Director of Disability Resources at the University of Arizona, where, as well as managing a staff of 32 employees who provide services to university staff and students with disabilities, she also offers consultation and education on designing inclusive learning and working environments. And before her move to work in higher education, Sue worked in public and private rehabilitation, and her academic training, both at master's and doctoral level, is in the field of rehabilitation. Sue publishes on disability and higher education. She teaches undergraduate courses in disability studies, and she advises graduate students. She's active in research, and she has consulted widely within the US and internationally. And so we're absolutely delighted to welcome you, Sue, to talk to us on the power of design, inclusion or exclusion.
I am incredibly honored to be giving your 13th annual disability lecture. I must tell you that there is something very daunting about being invited to Cambridge University to lecture. I don't know if you all intentionally kind of promote that kind of intimidation, or if it is a U.S. kind of malady. I suspect the latter. We tend to talk boldly and audaciously in the U.S., but inside we're just a bundle of fears and anxieties. So help me through this one, okay? I want to thank John Harding and the DRC team for the invitation and all the planning and preparation. Kirsty Wayland and Laura Gisborne were especially helpful, and I told Laura, she told me I didn't have to, but I told her I was going to publicly apologize to her because I insisted on calling her Lisa for a good amount of time, and this was even after she politely told me her name was Laura. So I'm quite sure she was wondering about the wisdom of me as the choice for the annual lecture. Thanks also to Jane McClarty for the introduction, and I also want to thank Ray Jobling and all the staff at St. John's for hosting. And I too understand that the Equality and Diversity team co-fund the lecture and provide support and assistance, so thank you to them. And of course, a warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here this afternoon. My dear spouse, Kevin, is in the audience somewhere. I don't know, he probably tried to get away so that he wouldn't distract me, but we both have so enjoyed our few days here in Cambridge. We've been busy touring the colleges and the museums, and I tell you, it is really something. So I think my expectations of Cambridge are certainly being met. So you all must be very proud of your fine university and this wonderful community. As Jane said, my presentation tonight is entitled The Power of Design, Inclusion or Exclusion. You'll see this on the slide. And it's not really a speech about opening our doors, even though doors still tend to be a problem, but it is a speech more about the culture behind the doors. I believe that the disability experience epitomizes that of many other marginalized groups. All of us insisting that we not only be let in the door, but into the various rooms, including the rooms of power, and with the understanding that once inside, we may want to rearrange the furniture, remove some walls, use captions and electronic print, and generally move in as co-owners rather than short-term tenants that many's too strong, that some are hoping we are. New perspectives seldom appear when people strongly share the same culture and life experiences, and therefore use the same unconscious mental models to interpret what is going on around them and to design their responses. This first slide is a quote by a gentleman named Warren Berger. He has website called actually I think it's called A More Beautiful Question. And he has this quote on his website where he says, "Why do we not appreciate that it is not about the world of design, but about the design of the world?" My hope is that we all will leave today with some appreciation of that the design of the world is the important concern. My next slide says, society is deliberately perpetuating the disablement of many of its citizens. Yikes. Deliberately is a tough word, isn't it? Well, I want to tell you a little story before I get started with my speech. And I didn't know if I would have a story because I wanted it to be a current story. And I should have known better because as a wheelchair user, I get stories. I have stories every day about design. But this one was particularly interesting, funny, aggravating, and I thought I'd share it with you. When we landed in London, and the airline was British Airlines, or Airways. Is it British Airways? British Airways? And that's really not relevant. This could have been any airline, I promise. So I don't want you to think I'm picking on the Brits. But we landed after 10 hours in this plane. And actually, I had never moved. It was so tight. I don't think, Kevin, I don't think you got up either. 10 hours, we hadn't moved. And so we got pulled in, and we waited, and we waited. Everybody's standing up, can't wait to get out. We waited, and we waited about a good 10 minutes, and then they came on and said, we're having some issues with the jetway. It won't seem to connect to the airplane. And so everybody went, oh, yeah, right, and so we waited a little more. And finally, 10 more minutes went by, and they said, it appears that we are not going to be able to fix it. So hold on, we're going to get the stairs. So we waited another 10 minutes, and then it was time for the stairs. So everybody's up, and I can use crutches. So I have crutches that I use. I'm not a very good walker anymore, but I can navigate a bit. So I was walking on my crutches out of the plane, and I was concerned about my chair, because whenever the routine changes, you never know where that chair is going to end up. And so as I was walking out of the plane, I said to the first flight attendant, I'm concerned about where my chair is going to be. Oh, don't worry. The chair will be at the bottom of the stairs. You can manage the stairs okay, right? And I typically don't even answer those questions. Kevin does, because I pretend I don't hear them. So I kept going, and then I got to the next flight attendant, and I said, I'm a little concerned about my chair. And she said, oh, we have it. It will meet you at the bottom of the stairs. The stairs are okay, right? And I said, we're going to make it work. So the stairs this is a big plane. So the stairs are a lot of stairs, and they're steep. And I'm kind of starting to navigate down, and all of a sudden the flight attendant comes running down in front of me and gets right in front of me. She said, I've just got to help. And Kevin, again, says, oh, it's better to not help her. So I kept kind of maneuvering down the steps, and we got to the bottom of the steps. I know this story's going on too long, but it's an important story. So I got to the bottom of the steps, and I said, I'm concerned about my chair. My chair wasn't there. And a man comes running, and he said, oh, your chair is up there. And that was sort of like, you get down these steps, and then you go up the steps of the jetway, and your chair will be up there. And I said, I got down, but I know I can't get up those stairs. I just knew I wouldn't be able to. Oh, well, that's okay. Follow me, and we'll get your chair. And so we follow him under the plane and to this little vehicle, and there's a lift on the back. And he puts me on that lift, and we ride up, and then I walk into this vehicle, and it's very nice. And oh, I forgot to tell you, it's blowing like 60 miles an hour on the tarmac. Could hardly stay upright. But we get into this little vehicle, and it's really warm, and there's seats. And so we kind of sit down, and then they bring my chair, right? This is after now I'm in. And they bring the chair, and they're trying to get it into this little door, right? So he's lifting it up real high, and the chair, the brake's not on, so it's falling over, and the other guy's trying to get it in, and then they pull it in through this little door, right? So then I'm finally with my chair, and we're sitting there, and this vehicle goes up, so it raises up, and it moves forward, I don't know, maybe 10 feet, and connects to the other side of the airplane, you know, where they bring in the food and stuff on the other side of the galley. Moves in, connects there, a door opens, and these two lovely elderly people just walk in. And I'm like trying to remain composed, but it's like, so Kevin turned to me and he said, "I'll bet they're first class." So anyway, that was our story in getting here. And of course, you know, that had a design to it, didn't it? That whole experience. So of course, if the jetway had worked, great. But even without the jetway working, they had an option. And it didn't kick in. And Kevin and I were talking about the number of people it took to kind of arrange for me to get to my chair, for my chair to get to me. Anyway, remarkable, I think, example of poor design. But anyway, let's get back to this slide. So I say that society is deliberately perpetuating the disablement of many of its citizens. And deliberately is a troubling word, right? That's hardcore. And I think also in some respects, society is kind of a troubling word, right? So both of those maybe not this crowd, but to many people, it would be a little jarring. I actually thought, well, what's a softer word than deliberately? So I looked up deliberately, and I looked at some synonyms and some antonyms. And of course, the antonyms are a little softer. It might be unwittingly, right? Unintentionally. But that didn't fit for me. So then I thought, well, maybe there's a synonym that doesn't sound quite so harsh. Do you know what the synonyms are for deliberately, knowingly, premeditatively, purposely, willfully, with eyes wide open, and finally, this is the killer, in cold blood. So even if we remove those words, deliberate or society, the notion that something external, something outside of the individual is disabling is news to many. Again, maybe not so much for you all here, but for most of the world, that is news. And that is because individual differences are the primary problem. And it is individual difference that receives our primary focus, our remedies, treatments, all in an attempt to maybe mainstream, to assimilate, to accommodate, to fix, to correct. And probably the worst is to eradicate. So what's going on? We define normal in our cultures and societies. Our societies function around this concept. And anyone who cannot or does not want to operate within this concept must be abnormal, must be deficient, must be odd, must be scarier. Rights, benefits, and opportunities are afforded to people that we deem normal. Those assumed to have significant differences are treated differently. and may not have the same experiences and opportunities. Societies tend to focus on the individual differences and turn them into problems to be addressed, rather than dealing with systemic systems and structures that create barriers. But I do believe there is a design storm brewing, an epidemic maybe. Simply put, it's a holistic approach to solving problems from a user perspective. It's about designing the user experience. The blogs are generating new thoughts and materials about how designers are penetrating new spaces. More clients are asking designers to think about a wider range of issues. Design is being recognized as the most important function in our society. Think about that. Design recognized as the most important function in our society. Perhaps the only thing, some people will say, that can guarantee the future if we redefine and transform it to be socially responsible. When we look back in 100 years, we may see very well the design storm as a shining example, not unlike the great industrial revolution. But the challenge is to diminish the power of the normalcy construct and include access and inclusion in our notion of socially responsible. And it is amazing to me how easily those two concepts, access and inclusion, fall off one's radar when designing. Just another quick story. Just before I left the US, got another call from the biology department, and there's one class that always does a field trip. We work with the biology department every friggin' year, okay? And we talk to them about this field trip and how it can be designed, and they always get excited and go, all right, next year we're gonna remember that, right? Well, the annual field trip was upon us, and we happened to have 3 students who were chair users. And what they do is they have them meet on a path, but then the students go off into the desert, which is not an easy thing to do, go off in the desert. But they're supposed to kind of go up this hill, and they identify plants. And then they meet under a ramada to discuss their data findings. Students arrive via buses, which the department pays for, okay? So 3 chair users in this class. And there's a new instructor who apparently did not drink our Kool-Aid, because our suggestion, as it had been every year, was divide the class up into groups. Some groups can go off up the hill. Some groups can stay around the path, right? The university has a wheelchair accessible van. You can rent that just like you can rent the non-accessible van, okay? This faculty member, though, of course it was late. We weren't involved. We figured it was going to happen, right? Faculty member calls and says she won't have it. She just will not have it. And those were her exact words. I will not have it. This compromises my course, and she wanted to let me know is the department is not going to be paying for an accessible van. So her solution was that the chair users can just choose to not go on the field trip. It's okay with her. They don't have to go, and they can just get their data from the other students when they return. So again, my next slide is a quote from Bertrand Russell, who says, in all affairs, it's a healthy thing now and then to hang a question mark on the thing you have long taken for granted. And here we were again, with a field trip happening the next day, and the biology department, this particular instructor, refusing to make these design changes. So again, it was about how can we make an individual accommodation that will work for these students. But what happens is we take that normal construct for granted, oftentimes not questioning it or appreciating its power. This is not an unusual response from a faculty member, although I wouldn't want you to think that the faculty at the University of Arizona are all this hardcore. We mostly find faculty, once we talk to them, as getting quite excited about the possibility of redesigning their class to make it more inclusive. But we also do get a lot of this still. I don't know if that happens at Cambridge, but maybe. But again, it's sort of this getting stuck in what is normal. We need to recognize that all of us are the designers. And I guess if we take one thing away today, I'd like you to take that away, to recognize that we are all designers. All are agents of social change. So this storm, this revolution, is not just about the professional designer. This means that we all have the power to creatively resolve problems and design sustainable and improved solutions. So it's whether we're teaching a course, whether we're developing a program, for those of you that are on the service side of the house, our service delivery practices, our activities, and our policies, okay? Design has the power to make us feel competent or incompetent. It has the power to include us or exclude us. And this is a quote by Elaine Ostroff, who is head of the Institute for Human-Centered Design. So think about that a minute. We are all simultaneously privileged and oppressed by design. I had actually thought about that as a title for this. I was going to call it, I don't know, oppression by design or exclusion by design. It seemed way too out there, so I changed it. But think about it. We actually are, all of us in here, are both privileged and hampered by design. Take a minute and think about yourself and your many different characteristics. And try to identify a design or those designs. Maybe it's a product. You know, it might be that cell phone, or I don't know. We used to call them VCRs. You can tell how old I am. What are those things that record now? What do we call those? Video? DVRs, thank you. But think about, maybe there's a policy that has impacted you negatively or positively, an activity, a space, okay, that hampers you, or a design that might privilege you. For me, it might be my dang tire pump, right? I have this tire pump that has a cord about this long to plug in, right? And so I, not being able to kind of stand up and do it all, literally, I'm sitting on my garage floor, plugging this in, and then finding something to set it on, bringing my tire, and then the cord to the tire is only about that long. And I got so frustrated about 5 days ago that I literally threw it in the garbage can. I felt so incompetent and so aggravated with it. For Native Americans in Arizona, it might be a rule, an interscholastic association rule about hair control that won't allow them to wear these neat, low buns with yarn in their team colors, wound tightly around the bun. It expresses team pride and cultural might, and they are not allowed to wear those at their basketball games. So the designs that you may think of for yourself, do they include you or exclude you? Make you feel competent or incompetent? Think about that design. What seems to be the most important to the designer? What kind of users is he or she designing for? I mean, who designed that hair control rule? Who are they designing for? Think about changes in the design that would increase its effectiveness. For me, in that tire pump, all it would have taken was a longer cord, really, and it would have, I probably wouldn't have thrown it away. and I'm going to go buy another one with the longer cords, and I'm going to let that company know. Many of you may discover that most environments seem to be mostly designed for you. Maybe not perfectly, but they work, and you don't give them a lot of thought or attention. But there are groups that are impacted by design very significantly and on a regular basis. Those groups who are a little too different. For them, the impact can be outright exclusion or at least marginalization. For many disabled people, and I suspect for other marginalized groups, the experience is like being let into a dance but is not asked to dance. Okay? I can get into the dance, but I'm not dancing and I'm not asked to dance. What does this mean exactly? For disabled students, this might mean that you are admitted to a university, but you may not be meaningfully participating in classes, programs, activities, or may experience a somewhat separate but sort of equal experiences. Examples might be, I have to take my exams in a separate location. I have to find a substitution for field work. I might be denied a study abroad opportunity. I might have to sit through videos and PowerPoint slides, mine for one, that are not captioned or audio described. I might have to get textbooks and other print readings recorded or digitized, or just having to spend an inordinate amount of time arranging or coordinating special services. In essence, what it means is that design ensures that the disabled student experience will be quite different from a non-disabled student experience. They're in the door, they're at the dance, but they may not be dancing, okay? And I want to give you an example from my own shop back at the University of Arizona. About, I'd say, before we got serious about applying social model thinking to our services, this was our testing accommodation practice, okay? So if a student, let's say a student who processed information differently, right, is going to find a 50-minute bubble sheet, pen and paper exam, not the most accessible, not the most inclusive, certainly a big concern that, you know, that would not be really assessing their learning, okay? So a test accommodation would be reasonable. So in order to get a test accommodation at our facility about 8 years ago, maybe even 6 years ago, students come in, right? They've got to identify themselves, which seems only fair. So they come in, but then it's about the documentation, you know, the proof, okay? And then there was a lot of steps that they had to go through to get the right kind of proof for an exam accommodation. And I could talk to you about all of that, but it would bore you to tears. But things like can't be older than 3 years old, has to be from a certain kind of a professional, certain tests had to be administered. Anyway, it was unbelievable. So they had to prove that they were legit. Then once the proof was there, we had to have a conversation about, okay, then is this reasonable? And we would have to look at each class, right, to be sure that an exam accommodation was reasonable. Once we and the student kind of agreed on that, the student took a form, and there was a form for every class. And they would go to their instructor and have a conversation with their instructor about their situation and get the instructor to sign that sheet. And then when those were all signed, they would bring them back to the DRC, and we would check them to be sure that they were all in order. We should have had a stamp. I don't believe we had a stamp. But we checked them to be sure they were in order. Then we said, okay, now you need to go upstairs to the exam administration office and turn these in and get your exam scheduled. So the students would go upstairs, turn their forms in, and schedule their exams. Then on the day of the exam, they would go to their class, pick up their exam that was carefully sealed and signed, bring their exam back to the DRC, get in their spot, take the exam, and guess what? When the exam was over, we would reseal it and sign it, and they would take it back to the instructor. So I don't know how many steps you counted there, but there were a lot of steps, okay? That was what a disabled student had to do in order to have access to an exam. So as we began to think about what we really valued and believed about disability, which I know you Brits have got this down because it's your researchers that I rely on, but the social model, right? We know what that means. And we intellectually did too, but we sure weren't applying it, right? Our practices were medical model, right? Come in, we'll write you a prescription. So as we took a look at that, we realized the disabled student experience was very different from a non-disabled student experience. What does a non-disabled student have to do to take an exam? What do they have to do? Yeah, show up, right? Show up. But a disabled student had 10, 12 steps, okay? This is a quote, a 1982 quote from the US Department of Education, and it says, "The world which people have constructed is made by and for non-disabled people, for those who can climb stairs, turn doorknobs and faucets, see where they are going, hear noises and voices, commit instructions and information quickly to memory. Our educational programs reflect these values." Shortly after I read this quote, so this has been almost 25 years ago, I was not fully appreciating how provocative it was. And I still go, 1982, this is pretty good stuff, especially from the US Department of Education. But I had an aha moment regarding design, okay? And I was meeting with a statistics professor about an individual student. And the individual student was not asking, but was saying, I'm worried because this professor requires that we memorize all of the statistical formulas. So when we go into the exam, we have to have all those in our head, and then of course know which one to use. And I'm just not sure that's anything I'm going to be able to do. And this was a student with a learning disability. There was quite a bit of documentation. So I said, let me go talk to this guy, right? So I went and talked with this instructor, and we were really having a great conversation. And it's kind of like I was telling Jane before I started, I try not to go in wagging my finger about, you got to do this, as more about wondering, right? Can you wonder with me? And we were having a great conversation about what is the essential knowledge that he wanted his students to be able to learn. And so we were talking about that. And I don't want to go on here too long. We had a fairly long conversation. But all of a sudden, he looked at me and said, memorizing formulas really isn't where it's at, is it? It's not really what I need to be testing, is whether they memorize the formula. What I want to know is, can they pick the right formula to use in a certain problem? And I said, yeah. So I said, so it'd be okay then, right, if this student brought in like maybe cards with the formulas on it? Would that be okay? I'm still real stuck in an individual accommodation, right? That's what I was trying to get. And he looked at me and he said, no, I'm gonna put the formulas on the test for all of the students, right? Because that doesn't make sense to me anymore, that I'm asking them to memorize these formulas. So why would the disabled student get cards and the other students wouldn't, right? And it really was an aha moment for me when I realized what good design is, right? good design is good for everyone, right? It's not just something we do for a disabled student. So while we are all impacted by design, not everyone is significantly excluded or marginalized by design. And that is because when we design, we tend to design with a certain standard in mind. And then it's back to that normalcy standard. So now I say this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but while the non-disabled, white, heterosexual, Christian male oftentimes can be that unconscious standard, right? We know that is not the reality. It probably never was the reality, right? But certainly has been our reality for a long time. The reality is human variation. Differentness and differences brand each one of us. So when working to increase access and inclusion, we tend to focus on the individual, the human variation, as the problem. So then we end up individually accommodating, which of course is better than what's happened to disabled people historically, which, you know, when you think of institutionalization and euthanasia and all of that. But still, we could alleviate many of these reactive and consumable modifications and accommodations if we were to focus on the real problem. So what do we do now? Many of us, myself included, but I'm trying to get away from it, use the phrase universal design. But practically, we really don't know what to do with it. And many are suspicious of the word universal. So the end result is, of course, not universal and not inclusive, i.e., I got into the dance, but I'm not dancing. It might be that we need to think of universal design as a philosophical construct to guide our work, rather than just a checklist that we go through. The checklist alone may not be enough for us to internalize the notion that design is a moral issue. Design is a social justice issue. And we need to ask ourselves the big questions. Why do we design in ways that exclude? What might happen if we genuinely embraced and valued human variation? And what role can I play, all of you, in designing for access and inclusion? If our goal is to have people get into the dance, be invited to dance, and then dance, how might we play a role in reaching that goal? Probably a big first step is that we need to recognize many of us, and I would say all of us, disabled and non-disabled, because even those of us with disabilities oftentimes forget about the other disabilities, okay? So this is for all of us. We need to recognize that not having to consider access and inclusion is a form of privilege, okay? And we need to fess up to our privilege. And that oftentimes is the first step toward increasing access and equity. The other big thing we need to do is what we've been talking about, is we need to understand the relationship between design and exclusion. And I have a couple examples here. So one is a picture of steps going up to nowhere. Okay, the door is off to the left side, so you would go up the steps and walk into the wall. Another great picture is a gentleman at a urinal, and the urinals are all so high that he's on a ladder in order to urinate. Another one that I love, this is called New Breed, it's called Poor Design. It's a picture of a swing set, right? And a guy was wanting to swing, but the chains are so long that he just lands on his face. It obviously will not swing, right? The chains are too long. And finally, this is the inconvenience store. And this is where everything is clear up on the ceiling. And not sure how anyone would get to those. So appreciate that most of our work around access and inclusion is focused on remediating, fixing, or correcting individuals, and sadly, oftentimes helping them to be grateful and satisfied with unsatisfactory situations. Sometimes I feel like that's what we do. We don't do it intentionally, but sometimes at the Disability Resource Center, I feel like we're trying to convince students to be happy and okay with these accommodations, right? And yes, the accommodations do increase access, but when you think about inclusion, they fall short. And yet we spend an inordinate amount of time trying to help them feel okay about it, right? So even when we say we embrace a social model of disability, our practices are not always aligned with that. It is very easy to intellectually say, this is what we believe, and then our behavior goes right back into all of the old thinking about difference. I think it's also important that we accept the fact that designing is not solely the scope of professional designers. And I said that before, I want to say it again. Okay? Applied to higher education, all of us play a role in designing student experiences, as well as the institution's structures, systems, and culture. We all could, and maybe do, hopefully, play a significant role in designing or redesigning that experience. This might mean that as designers and design thinkers, we observe and engage with a diverse population of students, understand their situations, and with empathy place ourselves in their positions to imagine what it would feel like to be that student. The challenge is to define and conceptualize users or students in all their human variation, to tap the ideas of marginalized and excluded populations, to engage users, students in design. Otherwise, of course, we will continue to design for a few rather than the many. Design thinkers, practitioners, and educators should join with diverse populations to generate creative ideas to design for and promote inclusion. That way, we create sustainable and inclusive environments and the cultural, social, and economic futures of more people expand. I don't know if any of you ever read the book by Malcolm Gladwell, The Tipping Point. Does anybody know that book, The Tipping Point? How little things can make a big difference. He talks about how we can create epidemics to realize social transformation. And as I said in the beginning, I like to think that the inclusive design epidemic has begun. But how do we all get on board and provoke and promote an inclusive design epidemic, to engage in those small changes that will tip exclusion and marginalization toward inclusion and connection? Well, we know that we need to agitate, right? We need to agitate for transforming the way our societies think about design, right? So we have a responsibility to advocate as an advocate, okay, for systemic change. So that's a role we can play. Then we need to demonstrate design's capacity to solve or at least decrease the exclusion marginalization problem. And that's the sphere that we have direct control over, right? We need to model where we can. So again, if we teach, that might be a course. If we're a service provider, it might be our practices, the way we deliver services. If we're at home, it might be the way we design our parties, right? Or our events. If we're an administrator, it might be the policies that we develop, okay? We all have a sphere that we have a little more direct control over, and that's where we can model good, inclusive design. And key is to bring together marginalized and excluded population as co-change leaders. Oftentimes I think people want that nice little checklist, like if I do this, 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 and this, right? But if we aren't engaged with populations that we all have deemed as a little too different, right? Our designs are not going to change much. We've got to immerse ourselves and engage with people who are different from ourselves. We can choose to accept and continue practicing exclusion through our designs, attitudes, and assumptions, or we can choose inclusion through design and attitudes that embrace and value difference. Oh, I forgot this one. This was one of my other pictures, sorry. This is another example of bad design. It's a picture of a toilet and the door bumps into it, and so they cut out just a little piece of the door so that it would kind of go around the toilet. Anyway, I actually found these online. There's lots of them. So my final slide is a quote by Brian Collins, who's in advertising. And he said that design is not a plan for decoration. Design is a plan for action. And it fits with what I've said previously, that design is a moral issue. Design is a social justice issue. And that we are all designers. And if our goals are access, inclusion, sustainability, social justice, social responsibility, then we must ask ourselves, what is the good work for me to do? And it is about applying design to the full spectrum of our work and our personal lives, recognizing that everything we do has a design, that it matters, that it communicates a message, and it has consequences. And it is about depathologizing human variation and working to solve the real problem, the design of our world. Thank you. Thank you. Wow, that was quite an applause. Thank you.
So I think you can tell by the length of time that applause went on how really great that talk was. I think people will agree it's really motivating that we're all agents for social change. Now, I think this is the first time we've had an all-woman panel up here on the
right.
stage. So let's celebrate that. Can I take the first question from a woman? Yes.
Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you for a great paper.
Thank you.
It was very interesting. And my name's Abby, and I'm from Keele University in Staffordshire, and I'm working on my PhD looking at access to legal education for persons with disabilities, but particularly from a content angle. And I noticed that you talked about designing courses and things, but one of the things that I'm trying to look into is that at the moment it seems to be that we only present disability in the legal education context, either in terms of discrimination, employment, and potential defences to murder, which I think is quite interesting in terms of diminished capacity and responsibility. So I was just wondering if you, in your experience at the University of Arizona, had any sort of any input on content design with
Yes,
teachers.
I'm really glad. Did I cut you off? I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
Okay. I'm really glad you brought that up because content is design too, isn't it? So when we design classes, we're designing both the activities and the content, right? And you're absolutely right. Is our content representative, right, of our diverse world? And the problem relative to disability in the curriculum or in the academy is that it usually, almost always, is represented in the applied fields, like special education, or rehabilitation, or counseling, psychology. Well, psychology probably is not a fair one, but when you think of abnormal psych, you kind of think of it. But anyway, and so oftentimes in the humanities or in the law, disability is not even there. And if it is, it would be within a more pathological kind of context. So content is really another huge and very important piece in terms of design, is how does disability get represented, how does it get portrayed, how does it get talked about, and how doesn't it? And I think the absence of it is glaring in the academy. So we at the University of Arizona, we do not have a disability studies program, and I've often thought that we should have a disability studies program, and I still do. But I also remember, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Paul Longmore. He's a disability studies scholar from the U.S. And I remember talking with him about my frustration of getting a disability studies program going, because it looked like if it was going to go, it was going to end up in disability and psychoeducational studies, which is rehab, special ed, and I was, you know, that made me sad. And he talked to me about how he didn't know if that really should be the priority anyway, of having a disability studies. He said, you know, look at some of the others and how they've been kind of relegated off to the side. Instead, he really encouraged us, how do you infuse it into existing curriculum? So how do you get it into history, political science, and economics? And it is a great challenge. It is a great challenge. Don't you think? Yeah.
Could I bring in another aspect of this? I am a retired university careers advisor, but I have a stammer, what in the States you call a stutter, but it's the same thing. And I was for many years a trustee of the British Stammering Association. One of our concerns was that technology was fine, because email and social media, you can be very fluent in it. It's wonderful. You know, if you find it difficult to speak, as a lot of stammerers do, you can be very, very fluent in writing, in emails. The problem arises where organisations lay down rules about how you must speak at work in terms of how you answer the phone. It wasn't a problem for me when I started work 40 years ago. Nobody bothered. But as I got older and systems developed, I worked in one university where you had to answer the phone in a certain pattern, using certain words in the right order, and I can't do that. Answer machines drive me nuts, because I have to gear myself up to say what I want to say before I make the phone call, and if an answer machine cuts in, I've lost it. And I'm not alone in that. So I think that while, for many stammerers, modern IT is wonderful, there are some aspects of it where we fall down. Voice recognition, for instance, because our speech patterns are sometimes unusual. Our word order is not quite as it should be. We have to take breaths where perhaps a fluent person wouldn't. Sometimes we get cut off in the middle of a transaction. I have a terrible job dealing with my banking and my credit cards, because quite often they don't give me enough time to say what I need to say. So I think this is an area which we're interested in, and I imagine it's one of the things that you're saying, that the design ain't too bad, but there are some areas where, you know, in trying to make life easier, it's actually made it more difficult for us.
Yeah, exactly. I would say that's true. Jane and I were actually talking before we started too, and I think that's the kind of the problem with the word universal too, isn't it? It's like hard to find a design that's going to be right for everyone, and it seems like as we come up with a good design, it doesn't work for some. But I don't see that as a reason to not keep working design. And the one thing that caught my attention when you said about answering the phone, I know we struggle with this at the University of Arizona, because our office also works for workplace access, so we're doing accommodations for employees. And it's just amazing to me how many departments will write a job description and it will be how you should do your job, not what they want you to do, right? It ends up being how. And so talk about exclusion. So we go in and we try to have these conversations about this is what you're doing. And some say, oh, wow, that isn't what I meant or what I wanted to do. And then of others, of course you need to be able to hear and speak and get down on the floor and, whatever it was. But it is amazing to me how ingrained we are to think this is how something must be done, right? And forget about what is it that we want to have done. And I think we do that on the learning academic side too. And I think that really is an important piece in terms of good design. What is it that we want students to learn, right? Not how should they learn it.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I just wanted to talk about something that we used at the Open University. And it's an example of design in practice.
Great.
Relating specifically by the example of geology field trips, which for us at the residential schools has for a long time been impossible for an awful lot of students, and they would be class bound with trays of rocks and so on and so forth, but they couldn't get out in the field. The way that we got round it at the Open University was we created a thing called the alternative learning experience. So we used the concept, very similar to your design alterations here. I don't know whether you may have come across it, maybe you have. But it was the difficult thing wasn't the practicality or the tech. The engineering department were very quick on the draw with the kind of kit that you could use for this kind of thing. Most of it was caving equipment, basically, on small video cameras and so on and so forth. And what it meant was you could take people out to locations within reason, and you could have a tutor or possibly somebody else in the team looking at various aspects of rocks. But it was a way in which they crossed a Rubicon. It was a way in which that was actually applied. And it's interesting to me that in your institution you're using a concept to actually platform the way those changes can take place, because it can be very infectious. So it's a kind of example of your Gladwell trigger thing that we're very aware of with stickiness and stuff.
That's a great example. Thank you. Can you tell me, would the alternative experience be open to all students?
Also, yeah, I mean, essentially you had what you had was huge variations in people's capacity. Lots of senior citizens, for example, who didn't have the capacity they could do the trek out there, they couldn't get back. So this became something that gave them. This is good because it got them to these places, and
exactly.
they were, and they loved it. And I've worked for the Open University for over 20 years, and I know that it's a world of difference between people who are locked in a little room with the curtains closed in the summer and being out in the field. But they were equally happy when it was bucketing down with rain. So it was a good application of that platform.
That's great. We have a geosciences professor at the University of Arizona who has just developed an accessible study abroad experience in Italy. And I shouldn't have even started down this road because I couldn't even tell you what they're going to do over in Italy. There's something interesting about Italy and geosciences, something about the landscape. But he too has, gotten all of these individuals together, and they've collaborated and designed this really remarkable experience that is totally inclusive and accessible. So I really applaud the sciences because we see that in other little corners of our university too. Somehow you guys get into design more than some of.
It's interesting that the engineers in particular are willing to help.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Adam Highland. The Campaigns and Equality Director from Disabled Ed Social Enterprise. I totally agree with you that we are all responsible and we all need to be making society more accessible, inclusive, and agents of change, I think, is a really powerful term. I just wondered what your thoughts were in terms of having the input from disabled people in the design, because obviously it's those people who know what is needed and how that works with the wider society, if that makes sense.
Yes. So the question is, how do we include disabled people in design?
Input from
How
disabled people.
important you think it is?
Well, I think it's everything, actually. Well, everything, but I feel like that's what the new design thinking is asking us to do, is that we need to engage with users, and that we have to actually empathize with users about the experience of either a space or a policy or a course, right? And that is key to good inclusive design, is to engage with the users. And as I said in my remarks, the challenge for us is to be sure that we see the user in all of its human variation and its diversity. Otherwise, we tend to seek out users that are like us, right? So we've got to really challenge ourselves to engage with all of the human variation. And that's just key, because without it, our design is not going to be transformative, or in my opinion, socially responsible. And that's sort of the other piece. If we believe in access and inclusion, right, and then we should see design as a moral issue, and that prompts us to engage with users. But we haven't thought of it that way, right? Even though intellectually we may say, yeah, that sounds right, that isn't our practice. And so it's challenging. But it's so very important. And I go back to the statement that I made right in the beginning, that the design thinkers are saying is this is the most important work for the future of our planet, is design, socially responsible design. So it's key for me.
I'm afraid we have to stop there. I know we could all be asking questions all night. Can we thank Sue again for a fantastic simulation talk?